So I'd just like firstly to say good morning and welcome to everyone. Welcome to the second part of our four-part webinar series on strategic planning for 2021. Last week we kicked off the series with the number one killer of strategic planning, and today we're going to be discussing the four-step planning cycle and putting some framework around that for you. So just a reminder, we're going to be running the events for the next two Tuesdays, 11 a.m. Australian Eastern Daylight Time for the next 2 weeks. So after today, we've got two more dates, and they are the 8th of December. And the title for that particular webinar is going to be Your Plan and Executing It. And then we've got the 15th of December, which is Your Plan and Bringing That to Life. So make sure you just got those two diary dates locked in as well. I'll also put the link in the chat feature as well, just in case you do need to re-register. Before we continue on, I will just give you a few little quick housekeeping tips. So we're going to be recording this particular session, so I'll ensure that you get a copy of the recording. So if you want to re-watch or review any of today's content, that's possible. I'll also include a copy of the pitch deck, and that will also be emailed to you. And we have activated the chat feature down the bottom of your toolbar. So you can utilize that for asking any questions, and we'll make sure that we answer those for you. We've also activated the emojis. So if you want to give a clap or a thumbs up for Mark or Eric's content, that's an easy way to validate any of the topics that are actually resonating with you. And I know everyone is very familiar with Zoom, but this particular presentation is best in gallery view, so which is on the top left-hand corner of your screen. And last week, Andrea Poletti actually was the winner of the giveaway book for Mark Jones's new book titled The Power of Mentorship. And I'm going to be spinning my magic wheel again today, and so we'll also be giving away another copy of that book as well. So before I go on, I'd also like to just say what great company we're in. I know we haven't got so many people logged in as yet, but we've got lots of people registered, so I'm sure they'll all sort of come in at the last minute. Now, I'd like to introduce you to today's hosts, which is Eric Ryan and Mark Jones. I know you may have already been introduced to them previously, so I'll just do a quick wrap up of their bios. So Eric is the co-founder and principal of Mission Met LLC, a US-based firm that provides strategic planning services and software to small nonprofits and organisations. In addition to his consulting work, he has started a nonprofit, been an executive director, and served on several boards as a board chair. He's writing a book about strategic planning to support the growth and sustainability of organisations working with the nonprofit sectors. So welcome back, Eric. Let me introduce you now to Mark Jones. Mark is the co-founder and partner of GenArc Business Solutions, which is based in Lake Macquarie, New South Wales. And Mark maintains a highly engaged clientele across Australia, inclusive of industry associations, not-for-profit charitable organisations, slip of the tongue there, sorry, corporates and SMEs. He's the co-author of the Australian Small Business Mentoring Handbook and The Power of Mentorship text, which was published in late September of this year, which is the book that we're actually giving away. Mark's expertise is in the areas of strategic planning, strategy execution, peak performance and mentoring. And Eric and Mark first met in 2004 and have worked on several collaborative projects across the Asia Pacific region with a focus on strategy and change implementation, organisational development and team effectiveness since that time. So welcome, Mark, also. Okay, now I'm going to hand it over to you, Mark, but I'm going to be the controller of the pitch deck. So let me know if you need anything.
Okay, well, thanks, Sarah Jane, and welcome to everybody for backing up for week 2 of this webinar series. Really appreciate the time you're investing in this, and certainly hoping that by the end of the series, you're really going to have a lot more underpinning knowledge, I guess, and some tools and skills to enable you to really develop a strong, robust and sustainable strategic plan for your organisation in 2021. We're actually going to kick off with Eric doing a little bit of a simulation, if you like, to create some context in respect to strategic planning and to pull together some of the issues we discussed last week and where we're heading over the next 2 weeks as well. and then I'll give a bit of a summary, if you like, of a recap of last week, and we'll start drilling into week 2 of this series. So over to you, Eric.
Yeah, thanks, Mark, and thanks, Sarah Jane, for kicking this off. So about 30 years ago, it kind of blows me away when I think about it, but about 30 years ago, in my first career as a physics teacher, I was always doing demonstrations and things with my students at a secondary school level. And so whenever I have an opportunity to try to figure out how to do some sort of demo as it relates to strategic planning, which is the focus of our business, I'll see if I can pull something together. And several years ago, I came up with this little ball. It's a 2-part wooden ball. There's a little screw right there comes that keeps it together. And the idea, and what I'd like for you to think about, and this relates back to last week's session, what I'd like for you to think about is think of this ball as strategic planning. And I'm going to move my camera down here to my desk and show you actually how this works. So think of this ball as strategic planning, and think of this black part of the ball as the actual strategic plan itself, creating the strategic plan. And think of this as executing the strategic plan. So the two main significant components of strategic planning. Now, note that in the ball, most of the ball is represented by the execution component of it. And as we go through the 4 webinar series, and Mark and I were reinforced by, so much of what you get done is actually in the execution component of it. But what often happens, and this is what relates back to last week, what often happens with people is they spend a lot of their time creating a plan represented here. And what happens? It just ends up sitting there. And then it ends up collecting dust. And so that's pretty gross, right? You don't want a whole bunch of dust on your plan, especially that dust, which is pretty disgusting. But that's the problem. People spend so much of their time focusing only on creating the plan. And this is the main topic of last week. We call it the #1 killer of strategic planning. People create plans and then they just sit there. So that's not what you want. Nor, frankly, do you want to have a group of people that are good at just getting stuff done, but they're directionless. They're just kind of rolling all around. So what you're really after, and it's what Mark and I are going to be reinforcing over the next 3 webinars, is you want these two to be connected. You want to be thinking about not only how to create the best plan possible in the most expedient way, but you also want to be tying that to how you and your team are going to execute on it. So now your strategic planning has momentum, it's going in a direction and can carry your organization as far as you want. So you don't want this thing to collect dust, which again is the #1 killer, which we referenced last week. But you want to be thinking of it like this as a complete system. And in a few slides, and in a few moments, we'll get into some more details of what really comprises the strategic planning system itself. So Mark, back at you.
Good work. Thank you very much for that. A great metaphor, I'm sure. And it also, I guess, aligns with that famous saying that a rolling ball never gathers dust. So good job. I guess in hindsight, when we think about what we spoke about last week, we talked quite often across a number of issues based on the research from the Harvard Business Review that suggests that only 63% of organizations ever achieve their strategic objectives. And some of those other issues that get in the way, I guess, things like shifting priorities, having to meet grant and funding deadlines, CEOs being distracted by operational issues rather than the strategic work, managing staff and people issues. A lot of managers and executives I speak to say they get caught up with 80% of their time dealing with people stuff. So that helps to, I guess that impedes more so on their capacity to really focus on those strategic objectives. And, like emails. I mean, how many emails do we get caught up doing on a daily or weekly basis? So what we're really going to focus on today is to start to develop a framework, to give you some tools and some skills that will enable you to be more strategically focused and start to focus on the development of that plan. But before we do that, I wanted to share a couple of quotes, just from a rhetorical perspective, just to start to challenge your thinking about the concept of strategic planning, but more so the action, the doing of strategic planning. So a couple of quotes here I think are really worthwhile having a look at. A vision is not just a picture of what could be, it's an appeal to our better selves, a call to become something more. So again, we've got to do something. Again, success is a ladder that cannot be climbed with your hands in your pockets. And we need to be using all our resources, our legs, our arms, and we need to be really working on it. And again, one famous quote from Scott Winter, one of Eric's and my colleagues, people will support what they themselves create. We talked about that last week. Getting engagement, getting all of your stakeholder groups from the janitor through to the CEO involved in the process. And this is one that I used to use with a lot of the athletes I coached in peak performance in sport. There are no shortcuts to any place worth going or any goal worth pursuing. One has to commit to the process, and I like to say, actually do the work. So I want you to think about those sayings as, I guess, a metaphor for discussion today. This is all about action. This is all about doing. And what we are going to do today is actually give you a bit of homework to do in terms of being prepared so we can start to put some meat on that skeleton in your strategic plan for 2021. So in moving forward from there, we're going to start with a poll. And I'm going to ask you to look at the questions which Sarah Jane is going to post. And I'd like you to identify the three which you think are the most important in terms of things that need to be considered for effective strategic planning. We'll give you about 30 seconds to respond to these poll questions.
Hey, Mark, let's give them just a little bit longer than 30, if we could. There's 10 options or so here.
Yeah, they may need to scroll down a little bit.
Yeah.
I guess
is anyone actually being able to activate that? Because I'm noticing that it's not actually processing at the moment. Mark and Eric, are you able to?
Yeah, I can, sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, I'll just submit a poll just to make sure that it's working on my end. So I just submitted my responses there just for you to see that it's working, Sarah Jane.
I've done the same.
Okay. So I'm just going to end the poll and just share the results now. But on my side, it's not coming up with any results. Is it on your side?
Yes.
Yes, it is.
Okay, good. Okay, great. Good.
So just doing a quick analysis of the responses there. Number one, we had 100% having a clear purpose and vision, an ideal state, which we will certainly talk about today. Having a clear system or process to support strategy execution, again, which is the purpose of our being here these last couple of weeks and over the next coming weeks. And then there was a little bit of an equilibrium. There's 4 responses there, which everyone thought had some level of importance. I would certainly say that I think it's number 2 and number 3 there go hand in hand, both showing 25%. And having a clear and simple plan that resonates with stakeholders, I think, is important as well, because if there's a disconnect, people aren't going to support the process and they'll disengage quite quickly. So that's interesting. And I think that supports a lot about what Eric and I will be certainly sharing with you today. So I'm going to hand it over to Eric now to explain the structure, if you like, of a simple planning structure and process or a cycle, which will give some insights into the methodology which we use with our clients, both here in Australia and internationally, and so does Eric.
Thank you, Mark. So if you recall last week, if you were part of the webinar, one of the 3 causes that we talked about that led to plans collecting dust is that the leaders that were responsible for ensuring that strategic planning happened, they approached strategic planning as an event. Similar to that diagram, that visual I just gave you all a little while ago, where you just focus on creating a plan, this little black portion of this ball. And what Mark and I have learned over the years is that where we can be of most help, and frankly, where you all as leaders of your teams in the strategic planning can be of significant help to your team, is to reinforce for everybody that it's not an event, but it's actually an ongoing, never-ending process. And but what is that? So that's nice, Eric. So what do you mean by a process and everything? So what we're going to share with you is a model for what that process, we call it a cycle, for what that process can look like. And we'll give you the 4 steps, and you can use that model. And note the CAPE on the right-hand side, because that's going to come up here in just a moment. Why are these crazy guys putting a woman with a CAPE and this funny mask on this slide here? What does that have to do with anything? Well, the CAPE here is actually going to be very relevant in just a moment. So Sarah Jane. So our model that we have is we want you to think of strategic planning as a cycle. And you can see it on the bottom of the screen there. We call it the CAPE cycle. And CAPE is an acronym that will reveal itself in just a second. 4 steps, 4 simple steps that you can organize all of your strategic planning around. Step 1 is called champion. And what that is about is identifying 1 or 2 people on your team that will champion the strategic planning process. And not Mark or I have ever seen an organization, a business, nonprofit, whatever, succeed at this stuff, succeed at strategic planning without having 1 or 2 people that everyone knew is serving as what we call the champion. What is a champion? We'll get into that here in a few moments, but it's basically the leadership of the strategic planning process. Step 2, Sarah Jane, is an assessment, is to assess. So now we're moving into what you kind of commonly think of with strategic planning, doing some form of analysis, some form of assessment of your organization that will then give you the data and information for step 3, Sarah Jane, which is to plan. Now that step 2, assess, there's 2 core things that you want to be thinking about in your assessment. A, it's a great way to get your team engaged, and Mark's going to be referencing this later. So getting your team engaged, but it's also a great way, obviously, to get the data that will move you into step 3, which is the creation of your plan. And then you move into step 4, which is the execution. Now that graphic there is similar to this ball that I showed you earlier, where that grayish part of the ball of the cycle references the black part of this ball, and the turquoise part of that references the orange part of the ball. And so this is a cycle. You want as a leader, if one of the gifts we can give you from this 4 webinar series is that you view strategic planning as an ongoing, never-ending process, and you share that concept with your team. And what we're going to be doing is in today's session, step 1 and step 2, we're going to get into the details, a little bit of step 3 around goal setting. Next week, we'll be talking about step 3, the plan, and the last week, we'll be talking about the execution component of this. One last note on this cycle. We used to, when we first started this, we actually called it the APE cycle, the APE, and that was kind of monkeyish. So we ended up really realizing we needed another portion of this, frankly, which was the champion component of that, which is all about leadership. And we put that in about 10 years ago, and we've been running with it ever since. On the screen right here, you see our sample, and this really is just a sample. If you take those 4 components of the CAPE cycle, champion, assess, plan, and execute, you can see how over this timeline, you and your team might implement them. It doesn't have to be a year. A year is a nice timeline to kind of build a cadence. So that's what most of our customers do. But whatever time frame works for you, it doesn't have to begin in November, December. It could start at a different time. So this is just a sample. Your takeaway from this slide, hopefully, is that you see how the cycle actually has different time frames that it would operate on throughout the year, and starts to make it a little more realistic. Sarah Jane? So that's the CAPE cycle. So now we're going to go into the first step, the champion role. So as I said a few moments ago, the key thing here is on your team, you want to identify 1 or 2 people that will, quote unquote, champion the implementation of the CAPE cycle. They'll champion and lead your strategic planning process. In small organizations and businesses in particular, where people are running hard and they have all sorts of things to do, if you don't identify that person or persons, then that's where strategic planning can slip through the cracks. The reason why we use the term champion instead of leader or manager is because strategic planning is also one of those things that's best done when there's someone that has a lot of spirit behind it. Like they're enthused about it. Like, hey, let's get together. This is really great for our business. It would be able to create more benefit for our customers or more profit or whatever. And so that's why we use the term champion. We really want that someone to really be spirited behind that. And we do call that, as you see on the bottom slide, the overall champion or the overall champions. Sarah Jane? So what's important, so what does that really mean? What is an overall champion? Well, that person is not the person that does all the work. They aren't the only one who worries about it, and they aren't the ones that take all the blame if it all goes south, you know? Those are not the things. What the overall champion does are these sorts of things. So first item here is, as I said a few moments ago, we as a team want to look to that person to ensure that we're putting a process in place, the CAPE cycle, whatever your process is, that it's ongoing. You want to make sure that your team members have all the necessary resources, that they've got all of the stuff that they need, all the resources, all the insights, et cetera, to make sure that their strategic plan is executed. You want to make sure that the plan, we were referring to it here as the mission MET plan. That's that's referring to the software that we utilize for the planning. But you want to make sure that it's constantly on the team's agenda through meetings, through calendar invites, through calendar reminders, et cetera. You want to be able to engage the team in a conversation that is, what I need you to do is this, or what we should do together is this, or whatever it is. You want to provide some guidance, obviously, as a champion, which relates to number 5 here, providing ongoing support and accountability. So you're going to be making sure that the gold champions and the other people within the plan that we'll be talking about next week have the support they need and they're accountable and they're making reports. Item number 6 of all of these may be the most important one. It's super, super simple, but every single time that we help our champions document and create a planning calendar, because if it's not on your plan calendar, it's not going to happen. So this tactical item of getting your overall planning process on the calendar, when you're going to meet, when you're going to follow through, super, super helpful. So the champion is responsible for that. The champion sets a positive tone, and we have here the 3 C's. They celebrate, they collaborate, and they cater. Now, what cater references is food, literally food. Like when you're having your planning meetings, and if people are in person, bringing food, making it sort of celebratory, creating a good spirit of your team. These are all the different things the champion does. And of course, just make sure that they have access to all the relevant documents and so on. So essentially the champion is making sure that the team is well set up for their strategic planning process. Last point or last slide here is this concept of 1 or 2 questions. That's a question mark. 1 or 2 champions. That's a question. For most of the time that I've done my work, for years, up until about 5 or 6 years ago, I was of the camp that just you only needed 1 champion, because if you have multiple people that are leading it, it's hard to really know who's responsible. But I was sort of beaten down by my customers over the years, where they kept on showing me time and time again that teams that had 2 champions were doing just as well, if not better, than other organizations. The benefit of having a co-champion is that if there's 2 people leading this, your bench is a little deeper. You've got a couple of people on your team that have this strategic planning expertise and expectation by the team to be leading this. But you also have a mutual accountability partner. And it makes it a lot more enjoyable. You've got mutual accountability. It's going to get done instead of it just staying with one person. So you have to determine at your business or your organization what model you want, whether it's 1 or 2. I have seen a lot of success with the 2 champion model. But again, whatever works best for you, just as long as that champion role, whether it's 1 or 2 people that are carrying it forward, is really doing that well. So hand it over to you, Mark, and we'll go into step 2 of the CAPE cycle assess.
Yeah, look, I'll just reiterate a couple of points there from you too, Eric. Certainly from my experience, I always advocate for 2 champions. Every project team I have working with our platform here in Australia, we have 2 champions. And in some cases, within the subsets of some of those strategic objectives, we'll even have other people supporting them. So we'll talk about that next week. But I wanted people to broaden their thinking a little bit too. We're here really talking about strategic planning today, but this same model, the same approach can be used on projects. It can be a project management tool, can be used in change management implementation as well. So don't think too narrowly in terms of we can just use this type of structure, the strategic planning. I think it can be more broadly used across your organization. So I'm going to talk to you about the assessment, the analysis component of the strategic planning process. And we really need to start with now. We're looking at our organization, where it is right in this very point in time. And if we use COVID, for example, that's really made a lot of people question the whole organizational structure, its efficacy, its direction. In a lot of cases, businesses have pivoted because they've had to assess where they are now and their capacity to keep moving forward into the future. And really what we're looking about is identifying where we are now, but more importantly, where we'd like to see our organization finish in another 12 months time, 6 months time, 2 years time, whatever timeline. Now, I know from different parts of the world, we have different political structures. but I always encourage my clients to work within the political climate. We'll talk about a pestle analysis a little bit later today as well. But certainly a term of government here in Australia, for example, is 3 years. In the US, it's 4 years. So there's at times some level of political stability in terms of what you can envision for the next 2 or 3 years. After that, we pretty much need a crystal ball. It can be very guess orientated, it can be very hypothetical. Policy could change, government priorities could change, which can always impact on our strategic objectives. So let's move on and dig deeper into this. So we have used a Best View Yet framework, which is another tool that Eric and I have worked with extensively, and which we've sort of somewhat embedded into what we're doing now. And it's built around 3 questions. And the first question is to acknowledge what we've actually achieved in the past year. What have we really done well? What can we celebrate in terms of accomplishment? And let's make a note of that. And conversely, the second question becomes, well, what have been our disappointments over the past year? Where haven't we performed so well? What hasn't worked for us? What are the opportunities for improvement or change? And based on those 2 key questions, we go down to part 2, which is our third question. Well, based upon this initial review, what are some of the key lessons that we've learned? What can we take away from here in terms of change? What can we take away from here in understanding where we need to focus more of our resources, whether that be human capital or financial resources or systems and processes? And these are 3 very critical questions in creating that assessment piece. So let's look a little bit deeper.
Mark, I want to can you go back to that last slide for a second, Sarah Jane? Is that possible? I just want to highlight for everyone that Mark and I, for nearly 20 years, have used these 3 questions over and over and over and over again in our work with teams. They're super, super simple, but any one of you on the line can use these as you're doing some sort of assessment with your organization. What did we do well over the last year? What didn't work well over the last year? What did we learn? Wash, rinse, repeat. And it's just, and you just get really great analysis from that. So I just wanted to highlight that these weren't just kind of random questions that we came up with. We've been using these 3 in this sequence for years and years, and they're very simple and easy to answer, and you get a lot of really good dialogue as part of the assessment process.
And I'd like to include as well, Eric, on this point, but it's really about engagement here, because from my experience, sometimes I've seen the bright, public little receptionist at the front desk come out with the game changers.
Right.
This isn't a top-down driven initiative. This is where holistically we do a bit of assessment and get everyone's feedback.
Right. So as Mark's going through these slides, these are all really great questions you can use as part of your assessment process, but these 3 are real winners.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Mark.
Okay. So let's start with the vision. The first part of the understanding about strategic planning is we're forward thinking. We're looking forward. We're visioning what the future might look like. So these are some typical types of questions or scenarios. So describe specifically what your organization or business will look like in 2 years, whatever your desired time frame is. What will your staffing levels look like? What would your new sales targets, improved sales targets look like? What about our product mix and research and development? Where are we going with regards to that? And what about our operational procedures and systems? Now, are they serving us? The course of COVID and such forth, or other influences, environmental influences, are they relevant? Are they current? Do we need to change them? So these are the more deeper drilling down types of questions. But the big question is, for me, what are the barriers to you and your team in creating that vision of the future? If there's any barriers there, we need to overcome them right at the very beginning. This is all about engagement. Remember Scott's quote, people will support what they themselves create. So let's create a safe space for people to openly contribute to those conversations. Okay, next please. I talked before about the pestle analysis. A lot of people may be familiar with the PEST analysis. It's pretty typical in terms of strategic and operational planning. Sometimes a SWOT analysis is used, but in terms of strategy, I think the PEST analysis is a better fit. The typical pest analysis was built around the political, economic, social, and technological implications that may impact on the business. But in our modern world, as things have become, I guess, more controlled by governments and compliance and regulators and such forth, we're certainly seeing a lot more environmental and legal implications that need to be considered within the strategic planning framework. So if you haven't done too much research on the pestle analysis, we're not going to drill too deep into it today, but certainly these are the 6 key considerations which you should be looking at in terms of maintaining compliance and rigor around your strategic planning. So we'll go on to the next one. I always suggest that when we're doing any type of analysis or goal setting, we start with the end in mind. What is the end goal? What's the principle or the major objective that we're working towards? And we need to identify this first, and we work backwards. So I wanted to give you some sample of questions in terms of how you can frame that type of conversation within your organizations. So if we were to have, or our organization or our business to have its best year ever, what metrics could we use to determine that outcome? What are we measuring? What does good look like? What is the outcome we're working towards? Another one, if we to improve client relationships, it comes up all the time, client engagement, better customer relationships. So what does a good relationship really look like? And how do you measure it in terms of increased revenue or client engagement? What are the other metrics you could use to determine a great client relationship? Another couple of questions, again, starting with the end in mind and identifying the what first. So these questions are really built around what. If we are to significantly grow and improve our organizational culture, what does a good culture look like? And what key strategies do we need to initiate to deliver or support that outcome? Next one, revenue focused. If we were to set a goal of improving cash equity by $500,000 in the next financial year, what, again, specific purchasing behaviours and cost centres do we need to review to facilitate the realisation of that objective or that outcome? So we're starting with what. We need to determine what it is we're working towards. And then we work backwards from there. So if I put that into a graphical example for you, this is from a client I've been working with here in Australia this past year. Their business has grown exponentially, even with all the, I guess, frustration and uncertainty and the ambiguity of COVID-19. This is a service-driven organisation. And the first immediate impact of COVID-19 was that face-to-face engagement and contact with their clients was eliminated straight away. So they had to pivot. They had to reinvent themselves. They had to come up with new ways of engaging and still delivering service. And they needed to be able to measure their performance in that regard. Now, this was a challenging time for staff because everything they were used to doing and the models, the systems, the process they were using were no longer valid. They were void. They had to create new ones. So staff engagement was going to be a big challenge for them. So they set a goal to maintain or to achieve 90% of staff engagement by the 31st of August 2020. So we're talking a couple of months ago. By the 31st of July, a month prior, they'd done 3 monthly staff engagement surveys with all the changes that were going on in the organisation in that first 6 months. They achieved a 99% staff engagement satisfaction. That was just mind-blowing. They didn't expect it, but that's what the surveys resulted in. Goal progress. So they created some strategic goals and objectives. And for them to have a good year would have been, at least with all the uncertainty and ambiguity around the place, to achieve or close out 80% of those by the 30th of June 2021, the end of our financial year. As of the 11th, just a couple of weeks ago, they'd achieved 86% of those goals and objectives. They'd closed those projects out. Amazing. Cash equity. They wanted by the end of this fiscal year or this calendar year have $530,000 in cash equity in their bank account. As of the 31st of the 10th, again, only 5 weeks ago, and I know this number's changed since because they've got a lot of their government funding through. They already had 426,000 at that point in time. And then their client progress. Given they couldn't engage with their clients in that face-to-face environment, they had to create new ways of doing business, new ways of servicing their clients. And they set a target this year to have progression with all their client accounts. And this is a not-for-profit organisation. It's in the disability care and support service environment. They were hoping 70% would have been a good year for them. By the 11th, again, only 3 weeks ago, they were at 81%. So we know this process works. And what we're going to venture into over the next, or the remainder of today, in the next 2 weeks, is really clarifying that structure and process and showing you guys the tools and models that will give you the confidence to know that you can achieve similar types of outcomes. Next one, please.
Hey, Mark.
Yes,
So we have about 24 minutes left or so, and I know we're starting to shift over into the goals.
Yep.
Is it okay if we take a moment and discuss a comment that Ian put into the chat box and see if there's any other questions or comments from people? Could that work for our timing on this, Mark and Sarah Jane?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just looking at Ian's question now. Making sure all feedback is assessed impartially is important too. Agree 100%. Look, there are a number of diagnostic tools out there, Ian, that can facilitate that process. I've got a preference for one that I've used, I'm going to say probably 20 odd years now. I know Peter Trim is in part of our audience today as well. And I know, Peter, you've worked with me with this tool as well. It's called a beliefs research analysis, or a beliefs research tool. And what we do with this is we identify 15 or 16 questions which are really relevant to the performance and the cultural climate of the organisation. And we attempt, as a minimum, to allow up to 65 to 70% of people. We prefer to get 100% of people respond and participate if we can, but with shift work and different types of things, it's not always possible. But if we can get a sampling of 65 to 70% of people's beliefs in relation to those 15 or 16 issues, and we get it on above the line or below the line score. And because we've got such a broad sampling from, again, the janitor and the cleaners through to the CEO, it's quite holistic across the business. And sometimes the questions are quite targeted in terms to management and leadership performance, in terms of communication, team spirit and esprit de corps, cultural dynamics, psychological safety, all these types of issues. So the questions are tailored towards, I guess, the strategic objectives of the organisation as well. And we do those independently. There's no staff involvement in those consultations and surveys whatsoever. And quite often it's a very confronting report that comes back. But we need the truth. We need to know that starting point. We need clarity of what the real issues are. I asked a question before about what may inhibit or restrict our capacity to achieve on those outcomes or organisational objectives. Well, if you've got all these roadblocks in the way, it's never going to happen. Does that sort of make sense? So, you know, the idea of doing something like the beliefs research, and like I said, there's many others out there, is to really get an honest, transparent report. Management may not always like what they see or hear, but if we're going to, as consultants and advisors, we're going to be truly authentic. If we're going to be honourable in our work that we do with the staff, we need that level of transparency. Got anything to add, Eric?
No. I just want to just kind of take a step back for just a second so people can sort of see where we are in this process. So just so you know, what Mark and I are walking you through are the 4 steps of the strategic planning process. We just addressed champion a little while ago. Mark just addressed the assess component. We're going to start to move gently into the planning and so on. But Sarah Jane, if you don't mind, I think it's slide 17. I might be pushing you here, Sarah Jane. So if it doesn't, you can keep going. It's the one that has the 2 assessments, assessment part 1. Yeah. So then go forward 1 or 2. That one.
Yes.
So for you in the audience here, or if you're watching this, what this slide can help you with is what Mark just shared with you, or a series of different types of ways you can assess your organization or business. And there's a zillion different ways, but we are just sharing some of the ones that we like to do. How that fits into this slide is that what allows your strategic plan to truly be strategic is on the right-hand lower side where you see your assessment part 2. Like, if you have a vision, and Mark shared those questions, if you have a vision of where you and your team want your organization or business to be in at some point down the road, 2 or 3 years, and you have a basic assessment, the lower left-hand part of this slide around where your team is right now, that's where your strategic plan, the middle of the slide, comes in. Creating the plan that bridges where you are now to where you want to be, and you identifying the goals, the strategies, the culture, et cetera, that's going to help you get there. All those questions that Mark just showed, all of that goes into the creation of that assessment and engaging your team so you can do your best job, possible with the resources and capacity you have at addressing those questions, of addressing the assessment and creating the assessment. So anyhow, I'm just trying to like make sure that you can kind of see the pieces here. The champion thing, you've got to have a champion or champions that are leading this. You need to figure out exactly what your assessment will be so that you can then get your team engaged and move into the plan, which is step 3, which we're going to be going into.
Look, Peter Trim has just asked a very interesting question based around that as well, Eric. And Peter's question is, what do you do when the end the senior management has in mind is significantly different from what the staff think is achievable? I think there's 2 really key considerations here, and talking about this champion component. Generally speaking, if you're engaged as a consultant, like we are at times, to do this strategic work, the senior management, the CEO, executive in particular, they have identified a need. And they've probably in their own mind got some level of clarity or understanding about what they feel that need is. But we always encourage them to go back, to take a step out of that equation, to get that feedback, to do that upfront assessment. Because if it's a top-down driven initiative and people are pressured into behaving in particular ways, doing certain things that disconnects with them as individuals, but them as a collective, as a team, as a workplace culture, it's never going to happen. So that sense of ownership is again, going back to that notion of people will support what they themselves create, is one of the key things that I emphasize quite strongly with the managers, as you've called them there, Peter, the senior management. Say, look, if you want to go down this path, you've got to be prepared to the ebbs and highs, the lows, the speed bumps, because quite often they'll be there if you don't go through a structured process of getting your people on board. That stakeholder engagement is a critical piece to the puzzle. And when you look at without drilling down too much into the analysis that the Harvard Business Review found, and they surveyed 1,000 businesses to come up with those statistics, that lack of engagement was one of the principal issues that they talked about time and time and time again. So when the end is different, Peter, I guess it's a matter of getting to the drawing board and finding out where the common ground is. And that's another model that we use as a strategic tool, is to identifying what we call where is the common ground, the battleground, or the underground activity taking place in the organization. Because if we can identify that battleground and underground activity, we can do something about it. If we don't do anything, it just sits there and festers, and it will be undermining everything else we're trying to achieve strategically. How's that, Peter? Is there anything else? So you'd like to add anything, Peter? Would you like any comments?
I think that's good. It kind of explains the situation, I guess, one of the key issues that I'm seeing around me at the moment is senior management is looking 2 years down the track ahead at what the likely economic impact of COVID is, and the staff aren't seeing that as a reality. And so it's about getting them on the same page around the realities of the business environment as much as, and therefore what we need to do to overcome that.
Yeah, look, I often say to clients in terms of those external environmental influences, we certainly don't have a crystal ball. So, you know, we just can't make guesses. So we need to make informed decisions. And one thing that we can do quite successfully in business, if we narrow the focus down, we can make some informed judgments and decisions about what the next 6 months might look like, what the next 12 months might look like. And we can do that with an element of confidence. If we try that big, grandiose, big picture thinking, and I think particularly now, like with all these global travel restrictions and things, we've got no idea what another 12, 18 months, 2 years might look like at this point in time. So let's narrow the focus, pull it into what we can control, and make strategic decisions and have strategic conversations around those possibilities. Cool. Well, let's move back to where we were. And one of the things I want to talk about, and in terms of setting up next week as well, giving you guys a little bit of homework. We've all heard of SMART goals. I say down here, a Vista goal is a SMART alternative. I want to introduce you to a different level of conversation I have with clients around goal setting, particularly when we're trying to talk about strategy and strategic objectives. And the V is critically important. We need to be able to visualize it. Need to have some of understanding. Some of the questions I asked before, what does a good relationship look like? What would a good business performance look like? So we need to enable our staff and our key stakeholders to visualize that, to be able to see it. Now, whether we do that through graphic representation or do up some nice video and marketing collateral and tools, that's all great. But unless they buy into it, it's not going to happen either. They need to be inspired by it, which is what the I is. It needs to be almost an aspirational goal that wants them to get out of bed of a morning and participate in it, to be part of the team, to be part of the journey. Like SMART goals, we need a high level of specificity, particularly with strategic planning. We need to have some metrics that we're working towards. What is the specific goal? What is the volume, the dollar value? What is the number of widgets? We need to have something specific that we're going to measure, because what we can measure, we can manage. It certainly needs to be time referenced, and I'm going to give you some examples of some little short, sharp Vista goals in a moment. But we need some form of time reference and not a never-ending story. We need to hold people to account to deliver within certain timelines to keep the momentum of the strategic plan moving forward. And they need to be aspirational or action, or as we use in the Mission Met platform, these are action items, but they're tasks. These are things that need to be done. They need to have verbs in them. They're doing words. They're action orientated. So we like to say that Vista goals are a SMART alternative because they really are a call to action. So if we can move to the next one, I'll give you or we'll use this quote first, and I like this from John Pocock, and I've been using this quote for years. And part of this conversation, if we're going back to what Ian was talking about before, about that impartiality and making sure the assessment is holistic and all that sort of stuff. And I always come back to this. If you can get your people, or if you've got your people excited by the company vision and values, and you can weed out those people, that 10% who aren't, you will generally get people who are highly motivated to work in the company style. This one thing will give you business momentum. And generally speaking, there's always going to be resistance with change implementation programs or with strategic planning. So we need to be able to use the massive support to overcome the barriers. But and quite often you'll hear that notion that, you know, those who speak the loudest, they might be a minority group, but always get heard. Yes, true, but we need to somewhat get them to become advocates, to also become champions of the cause. So the more people we can get behind our vision and goals, the bigger chance we'll have of them coming to realization or fruition. So here's a couple of Vista goals. This one is from a client in Adelaide. I've got permission from a couple of my clients here to use these. They're a not-for-profit, and their goal was by the 29th of January 2021. So we're talking about 8 weeks to develop a strong brand story which resonates with philanthropic grant and donation sectors. So they've engaged a person like Sarah Jane, a marketing consultant company. We've stripped back everything that they believe they're good at, what they're known for, and we've started to rebuild it and really building some contemporary tools and engagement strategies, because one of their strategic objectives was to move away from the reliance on government funding. They wanted to get that equilibrium, that balance right between fee-for-service, between philanthropic or charitable donations, and their fee-for-service work. So this is part of their strategic objectives. So we can tell here that it's very specific, it's date referenced, and it tells a story. And it motivates, inspires them, because that's what they're all about. They're in that not-for-profit charitable sector. This is what their purpose is. So this is just another objective they've set. The next one from ELES, Learning Education Solutions on the Central Coast. They're experts in the learning design sector. They're into virtual reality, augmented reality, all that sort of stuff. But they're growing exponentially, and they're getting all these new contracts, and the CEOs almost freaking out. Their reputation is preceding them. To get invited to conferences and keynote speaking and stuff. So I said, look, man, you've got to really pull it back. You've got to have a look at what your capability and capacity is to deliver on this stuff. So by the 30th of November, which was yesterday, I haven't checked in yet. I'll probably do that this afternoon. But I've seen
30th up here, man.
Thank you. So I've still got some time. But you know, I've looked at the draft. I've given some critique and some feedback. We'll have this done today. But it was to develop a skills matrix to ascertain current skills gaps and to support the development of a long-term workforce planning strategy, if you like, and a professional development plan. Again, it's time referenced, it's specific, and it's empowering. It's pulling their team, like their team are all contributing to this. So they're just a couple of examples.
One thing I want to highlight here in both of those, Sarah Jane, we're going to make you dizzy here. If you can go back to that, thank you so much. Is the question, do you know when that goal is going to be accomplished? In both of those cases that you do, item number one, that goal is accomplished when we have developed. If I walk into the room and say, can you hand me your brand story? Yes, you hand over this document that says this is our brand story. Specific, it's done. Same thing with the one on the bottom, their skills matrix. It is done. So one of the key things you should be able to answer when you look at a goal is, do we know when this is actually going to be accomplished? Now, these aren't numbers. Like you think of goals that are metrics and numbers, which are fine, obviously, but there might be more of a process type of goal, kind of like these, but you still know when they're done. So I just want to, as you're thinking through writing your goals, that's a key element.
Yeah, and I think that is because we talk about means goals or process goals, and these are process goals to get to the end result. And we'll talk about that more next week in a lot more detail. Okay, next, please. So again, we'll just go and referring back to that Vista framework and how those goals were built around it. What I'd like you to do, in terms of, I guess, giving you a bit of homework, is to think about 1 or 2 strategic goals or objectives for your business. And I want you to have a go at writing them out in a Vista format using this acronym. And we will give a couple of people some opportunity next week to put them into our framework and see how they can be stripped down and become more action orientated and put some structure around them for you. So 1 or 2, and then we can pick some out from it. So I guess that brings us up to talking about next week's webinar. And this is where we're going to start the building of the plan and putting the execution or the action task in place so that we can actually execute on the delivery of that plan. Is there anything you'd like to add around that, Eric?
Yeah, I just think that hopefully your takeaway from today is thinking of strategic planning as an ongoing cycle. You now have a 4-part model for that. The champion, assess, plan, and execute. You have some insights on champion and assess, and next week we're going to show you a plan. We're going to show you can use the format. All of that we'll really talk about the plan next week a bunch.
Okay, very good. So just want to check in to see if there is any more questions prior to us getting to closing out the webinar. We've got about 5 minutes to go to ensure that we finish on time. Happy to take another question if there's any there. Okay, can't see anyone putting their hand up, so or writing in the chat. So again, as part of your participation and giving up some time to be here, we're going to do another random draw of participants today with Sarah Jane's wonderful wheel, and give everyone a chance for a copy of the book.
I just made an executive decision while you were doing the talking. So I've actually just narrowed it down from people who registered to those people who actually were able to take the time to join us today. So I just wanted to confirm that when I share my screen with you, that you can definitely see your name spinning there on the screen. Okay, here we go.
Oh, Rady, you've already got one.
Say spin again, spin again.
To remove him, yeah.
Yeah. Would you like, are you going to donate it back, Rady, so we give someone else a chance?
We are Indian givers.
If you remove him right there, Sarah Jane, he'll be off the next one. There we go.
Okay, here we go. We'll do another spin.
There we go.
Hi, Lucy. Yay.
Congratulations.
Hello. Thank you.
So we'll be in contact in regards to Sarah Jane will send you an email and we'll get all your contact details and send that off. If you need another copy, Rody, I'll send one to you. Okay, so just in wrapping things up then, same place, same time next week. We will be getting into the nuts and bolts of putting a plan together. You can sign up to next week's webinar by using the link on the screen or in the PowerPoint. Again, Sarah Jane will ensure that everyone gets the follow-up emails with the slide deck and the recording from today's webinar. And we thank you all very much for being here and loved the couple of questions we got, and look forward to seeing you all next week.
Thanks, everybody.